She was standing at the edge of her own party, wearing a dress that cost more than her first car, carrying his child inside her body, and watching her husband charm every person in the room except her. She told herself she was fine. She had been telling herself that for 2 years. She had explanations for everything. The phone always face down, the flowers on a random Tuesday, the late calls in a closed room, the name saved simply as C. Ramsey. She explained every single one, because explaining them was easier than knowing what they meant. But there is a moment, a cold, quiet, unmistakable moment, when a woman stops explaining and starts seeing. This is that moment. And what she does next will change everything. This story isn't just about betrayal. It's about the woman who almost disappeared inside her own life and found her way back to herself, one brutal truth at a time. If you've ever stayed somewhere too long because leaving felt like losing, stay with me. This one is for you. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, because stories like this are why this channel exists.
The champagne cork popped. The sound cut through everything. Through the string quartet in the corner, through 40 voices talking at once, through the particular bright laughter of people performing a good time. Clara Whitfield stood at the edge of her own living room and watched it happen. The cork, the pour, the glasses lifted, the faces turning toward her husband. Grant Whitfield moved through the room the way he always did, hand already extended before he reached the next person, smile already in place. The particular warmth he could produce on demand, aimed like a light at whoever stood in front of him. Clara watched him stop beside a couple near the fireplace. The man in a gray suit, the woman in burgundy. Grant said something. The woman put a hand to her chest and laughed. Clara had no idea what he said. She almost never did. She pressed her hand to her stomach and felt Oliver shift. A slow roll. Not a kick. More like a question. I know, she told him quietly. Almost time. She was 8 months pregnant. She was wearing a dress that cost more than her first car. Her hair had been done by a woman whose name she had already forgotten. The living room of the Whitfield estate was 40 feet long. The ceilings were 14 feet high, 4 different seating areas, each with its own fireplace. Outside, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the October garden blazed with 100 small white lights. It was perfect. It looked exactly like a photograph of a life, not quite like a life itself. Clara set her sparkling water on a passing tray. She took a breath. She told herself what she always told herself at these parties. He loves me. Look at what he's built for us. Look at this house. Look at this life. The thoughts arrived in order, like a practiced sequence. She had said them so many times they had worn smooth grooves in her mind. She could run through them quickly now, like touching a rosary in the dark. A waiter passed with a tray of canapés. She took one and didn't eat it. She looked across the room at her husband. Grant was laughing now, a full, open laugh, the kind he rarely produced at home. At home he was quieter, more measured. The laugh he used at parties was a performance version of the laugh she used to love. She remembered the real laugh. She had not heard it in a long time. She put the canapé down on the nearest surface. Oliver shifted again. All right, she told him. I'm all right. She was not entirely sure that was true. A hand landed on her lower back. She turned. Grant was there, materializing at her side with the ease of someone who had timed his return perfectly, present for the moments that mattered, absent for everything in between. You look tired, he said. He was smiling. The party smile, not the real one. Are you okay? I'm fine, she said. Fine. The word she used most. She had been fine for so long that she couldn't remember what a different answer would sound like. "Come sit down," he said. He steered her toward the nearest settee with the confidence of a man who never once wondered whether his direction would be followed. She sat. He stood over her for a moment. Something moved across his face. She couldn't read it. She used to be able to read every expression he had. That felt like a long time ago now. "I'll be back in 20 minutes, he said. He wasn't back in 20 minutes. Clara sat on the silk settee and watched the party swirl around her. The caterers in black and white, the guests in their October best, the string quartet playing something she recognized but couldn't name. She pulled out her phone. She checked it. Nothing. She locked it. She unlocked it. She locked it again. Grant was 20 feet away. He wasn't texting her. He wouldn't be texting her. He was right there, turning now to speak to a woman in a green dress, his hand on her husband's shoulder, completely available to everyone in this room except his pregnant wife, sitting alone on a silk settee. Clara put the phone in her clutch. She took it out again. "Stop it," she told herself. "You're being ridiculous. You're fine." She put the phone away. She looked out at this garden, the 100 white lights in the dark, the October wind moving through them, making them sway like something alive. She thought about a night 3 years ago, before they were married, when Grant had brought her here for the first time. They had stood at these same windows, and he had said, quietly, like it was a secret, "This could be ours someday." She had believed him. She had believed every version of the future he described. The thought arrived before she could stop it, clear and cold, like water from a tap in winter. When did I stop believing him? She pressed her lips together. She looked down at her stomach. Oliver moved. "I'm working on it," she told him. The party wound down past 10. Guests filed out in pairs and groups. The catering staff began to dismantle the evening, moving quietly through the room with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to erasing evidence of other people's celebrations. Grant materialized at Clara's side for the goodbyes. He was always there for the goodbyes. He put his arm around her and said something to the last departing couple about his beautiful, glowing wife. The couple cooed. The woman kissed Clara's cheek. The man shook Grant's hand. Clara smiled until the door closed. Then she was just standing in the entry hall with the caterers moving past her and the white lights still burning outside and the particular silence of a large house after the noise is gone. "Glass of water?" Grant asked. "I'll get it," she said. She walked to the kitchen. The kitchen was enormous. Marble counters, professional-grade appliances, a space designed for entertaining, not for the quiet act of one person filling a glass at midnight. She turned on the tap. Grant's phone was on the counter. She wasn't looking for it. She was reaching for a glass. But the screen lit up as she passed. A preview of a text message. She read it in the 2 seconds before the screen went dark. "Are you still coming tonight? The name was listed as C. Ramsey, Celeste Ramsey, Grant's executive assistant. Young, very efficient. He'd mentioned her 3 or 4 times in the last 2 months. Always with that same description. Very efficient. Clara stared at the dark screen. Business, she told herself. He has a call tonight. He mentioned it. This is about a call. She filled her glass. She went upstairs. She didn't ask. In their bedroom, she sat on the edge of her side of the bed. The room was enormous. Everything in this house was enormous. She had loved the size of it once. Now it sometimes felt like being inside something that had nothing to do with her. She heard Grant downstairs. The low rumble of his voice. A call, she told herself. A late call. He always had late calls. She lay on her side, both hands on her stomach. Oliver was quiet now. Settled. The baby moved less at night. her doctor had told her. That was normal. Clara looked at the ceiling. She had grown up in a 3-bedroom house in Asheville, North Carolina. Hardwood floors, and a kitchen that faced east and her mother's herb garden visible from the window. She had loved that house completely and simply, the way children love things, without analysis, without reservation. She thought about that house a lot lately. She was not sure what that meant. Downstairs, Grant's voice continued, low even, the particular tone he used for business. She closed her eyes. She thought C. Ramsey. She thought business call. That's all. You are fine. She lay in the dark and waited for sleep. It came, eventually. Slowly, like something reluctant. October became November. Clara did not ask about the text. She told herself she didn't need to. There was an explanation. She had a whole library of explanations, organized by subject, cross-referenced by occasion. Why Grant missed the 20-week ultrasound. A contract closing, Tokyo. The time difference. Why Grant stopped reaching for her hand at dinner. Stress. The Q4 numbers. The new development in Charleston. Why Grant's phone was always face down now. An article about screen time. He was trying to sleep better. She had an explanation for every small thing. What she didn't have was an explanation for the feeling in her chest. The feeling that had been there for months. Low and constant. Like a sound at a frequency no one else could hear. Dr. Sandra Howell's office was 15 minutes from the estate. Clara drove herself there. She had driven herself to every appointment for the last 2 months. This was fine, she told herself. She was capable. She had a car. She didn't need someone to escort her to a prenatal appointment. Dr. Howell reviewed the ultrasound with focused attention, the kind of attention that meant she was actually looking, not just scanning. Good positioning, she said. Head down, good movement. She looked up. How are you sleeping? Fine, Clara said. Dr. Howell looked at her over the top of the tablet. She had a specific look, a look that said she had heard the word fine from women sitting exactly where Clara was sitting many times before. Your blood pressure is slightly elevated, she said. Nothing alarming, but I want you resting more. Is there someone at home to help? My husband, Clara said. Dr. Howell wrote something in the chart. Clara watched her write it and thought, she doesn't believe me either. Nora Callahan arrived on a Thursday afternoon. She brought Thai food and the specific energy of someone who was sitting on something and running out of patience. They ate at the kitchen island. The good kitchen, the one with the windows that faced the garden. The professional kitchen, where the catering staff worked, was a different room entirely. Claire had stopped going into that kitchen. It didn't feel like hers. Nora was being careful. Clara noticed immediately. Nora was never careful. Nora was the person who said the thing you were not saying. She had once told a gallery owner his artist wasn't ready. To his face. At the opening, Nora did not do careful. She was doing it now. How's the nursery coming? Nora asked. Almost finished, Clara said. She looked at her friend. Nora, are you okay? I'm great, Nora said, too brightly. You're doing the thing. What thing? The thing where you've decided not to say something and you're being weird about it. Nora put down her chopsticks. She looked at Clara for a long moment. The kind of look that precedes honesty. I saw Grant last week, she said carefully. At Crestview. Crestview was a boutique hotel on the east side. Not one of Grant's development properties. The kind of place you chose when you didn't want to be seen. He was having lunch, Nora said. With who? Claire's voice was even. I don't know her. Young, dark hair, corner booth. She paused. They looked comfortable. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. He has lunch meetings, Clara said. Constantly. Clara, Nora. A long pause between them. Okay, Nora said softly. Okay? She picked up her chopsticks. They didn't talk about it for the rest of lunch. But when Nora left, she held Clara's hand at the door for a moment too long. The kind of hold that meant, I'm here whenever you're ready. Clara closed the door. She stood in the entry hall. Then she went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bathtub, fully clothed, both hands on her stomach, looking at the faucet. He has lunch meetings, she thought. He has them all the time. She almost believed it. Almost. That night, while Grant was in his home office with the door closed, Clara did something she had never done before. She Googled Celeste Ramsey. LinkedIn profile. Headshot. 26 years old. Business degree from Carver University. 2 previous firms before Grant hired her, 11 months ago. She was beautiful in the way that was immediately obvious and impossible to argue with. Clara noted this the way you note a fact. Without drama. Drama felt like the wrong response to something that was probably nothing. She closed the browser, opened it, closed it. She typed into the search bar at 1 in the morning, signs your husband is cheating. She read for 45 minutes. She recognized things, specific things, the phone face down, the vague business trips with unusually specific return times, the way Grant no longer asked how her appointments went, the flowers he had brought home 2 weeks ago, unexpectedly, on a Tuesday, white lilies, her favorite. She hadn't thought much about the flowers at the time, she thought about them now. When Grant did something unexpectedly kind, there was usually a reason that had nothing to do with her. She closed the browser. She deleted the search history. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark with one hand on Oliver and told herself she was doing this to herself. Confirmation bias, hormones, the particular anxiety of late pregnancy. She did not entirely believe herself. Over the next 2 weeks, Clara paid attention differently. Not dramatically, not with confrontation in mind. Quietly and clinically, the way she used to approach a building project, gathering information before drawing conclusions. Grant came home late 3 nights in a row. The Charleston project was in final design review, he said. Grant took a call in the garage on a Saturday. She watched through the kitchen window. He was facing the wall. That was not how he stood during business calls. Grant brought her flowers. White lilies again. The flowers made her feel worse than anything else on the list. She put them in a vase. Thank you, she said. You deserve them, he said. She looked at the flowers for a long time after he left the room. What did you do this time, Grant? Not a question she asked out loud. A question that had stopped feeling like a question. Clara was sitting in the nursery at 11 at night. The room was almost finished. Soft sage green. Hand-painted stars on the ceiling. The rocking chair by the window. She rocked slowly, both hands on her stomach. The room smelled like fresh paint and something floral from the small diffuser Nora had brought. Oliver pressed back against her hand, strong and deliberate. She said it out loud, quietly, to the painted stars above her. I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. Not a question, a statement of fact. She looked at the ceiling. I'm not making this up, she said. Oliver moved. She believed it. For the first time in months, she believed herself completely. Grant found her in the nursery at 11:30. He stood in the doorway. He looked at her in the rocking chair. Something moved across his face. Tenderness, possibly. The reflexive tenderness of a man looking at a pregnant woman and feeling something he never examined too closely. Come to bed, he said. You need sleep. In a minute, she said. He nodded. He left. She sat in the chair for another 10 minutes after the light in the hall went out. She was adding things up. She did not yet have a final number. but she was getting very close. The first piece of real evidence arrived on a Wednesday. Claire was looking for the insurance documents for the hospital pre-registration. She checked Grant's filing cabinet. He was in Manhattan for 2 days. A board meeting, he'd said. Third drawer, wrong drawer for the insurance folder. She found it anyway, and beside it, filed without any particular care, a hotel receipt. Crestview Hotel, 2 nights in October. The Thursday and Friday of the weekend, Grant said he had gone to look at a development site in the Hill District. The room had been billed to his personal credit card, not the company card, room service twice, a bottle of wine. Clara sat down in Grant's desk chair. She held the receipt. 2 nights. Personal card, the same hotel Nora had mentioned. There is an explanation, she thought. Stop, she thought. She sat without moving for a long time. The morning light came through the office windows in long angles. Somewhere outside, a bird was persistent and specific. The refrigerator in the kitchen 2 rooms away hummed steadily. She put the receipt in her pocket. She closed the drawer. She found the insurance documents. She left the office. She did not call Grant. That night, she called Nora. She didn't start with the receipt. She started with, "Tell me what you saw. Everything." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I've been waiting for you to ask me that," she said. She told Clara everything. The lunch at Crestview was not the first time. Nora had seen Grant's car outside the hotel on 2 other occasions. She was visiting a client whose office was on the same street. She hadn't said anything without proof. She didn't want to be wrong. She didn't want to be the one who broke Clara open in the last trimester of a pregnancy that had already been difficult. "I know," Clara said. "I know you are protecting me." "Are you okay?" Nora asked. "No," Clara said. A pause. "But I will be," she said. She had never said those words before. Not in that order, not with that certainty. She hung up. She went to the nursery. She sat in the rocking chair. She did not cry. She was past the point where tears were the immediate response. She was somewhere colder and cleaner than tears. She sat in the sage-green room under the painted stars and let herself know what she knew. He has been lying, for months, while she was pregnant with his child. She sat with it. She didn't push it away. She let it settle the way you let heavy things settle when you finally stop trying to hold them up. 2 days later, Grant came home. He was attentive in the careful, compensating way she had learned to recognize. He made coffee. He asked how her back was. He put his hand on her stomach and said, Oliver was getting so big. Claire smiled. She said the things expected of her. Inside, she was very quiet and very clear. That evening, Grant took a call in his home office. He left his laptop open on the kitchen island. Clara wasn't looking for anything. She was carrying her water glass to the sink. The screen was right there. An email. Open. Sender. C. Ramsey. Subject. The thing we talked about. She didn't read further. She looked at it for 3 seconds. She looked away. She turned on the tap. She washed her glass, slowly, carefully, focusing on the physical act the way you focus on something simple when your mind is doing something hard. When Grant came out of the office, 20 minutes later, she was in the living room with a book. "Good call?" she asked. "Good call," he said. She turned a page. That night, Clara searched her memory. Not the receipt, not the email. Further back. She remembered the weekend Grant said he was in San Francisco 14 months ago, right after she found out she was pregnant the first time. She had called him 4 times. He answered on the 4th, slightly breathless, slightly distracted. The time difference, she had thought. She remembered the Christmas party at Diane Whitfield's estate 2 years ago. Diane had introduced Celeste to the room with an unusual warmth. She had put her hand briefly on the young woman's arm. This is Grant's remarkable new assistant. Clara had thought nothing of it at the time. She thought about it now. Oh, she thought, just that. Oh. Nora arrived the next morning with 2 lattes and the look of someone who hadn't slept. "What do you need?" she said, before she was fully inside the door. They sat at the kitchen island. The morning light came through the garden windows. The coffee was strong and slightly too hot. "Did Diane know?" Clara asked. Nora went still. "Why would Diane—" She stopped. "She introduced Celeste with warmth," Clara said. "You know Diane. She doesn't do warmth for staff." Nora was quiet. "I think," she said carefully, "that Diane may have been doing what Diane always does." "Protecting Grant," Clara said. "Protecting the family." Clara nodded. She turned her coffee cup between her hands. "How long do you think it's been going on?" she asked. "I don't know," Nora said. "But, Clara?" She paused. "Do you have a lawyer?" Clara looked at her. "Not yet," she said. "I know someone," Nora said. Thomas Brennan's office was in a glass building downtown. He was 50 years old, and he had heard every version of this story. He listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, he asked about the money. Not the affair, the money. "Do you have access to your joint accounts?" he asked. "Of course," she said. "When did you last check them?" She paused. "Last month? Maybe?" "I want you to download 12 months of statements from every joint account this week," he said. "I want to see whether there are unusual withdrawals, round numbers, transfers you don't recognize." "You think he's hiding money?" Clara said. "I think," Thomas said carefully, "that when someone has been carrying on a long affair and has not been discovered, they often begin to think about what comes next." Clara was quiet. "How long do you think this has been going on?" she asked. "Based on what you've described," he said, "I would want to investigate a timeline of 8 to 12 months at minimum." 8 to 12 months. The entire pregnancy. She did not react. Not in his office. She sat straight and listened and wrote down the account names in a spiral notebook. Small, precise handwriting. The same handwriting she had used for architectural specifications at the firm she used to work for. The firm she had left 18 months ago because Grant said she should rest. On the sidewalk outside Thomas's building, she stopped. The city moved around her. Traffic. A delivery truck. A woman walking a dog. She put her hand on her stomach. Oliver shifted. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." She got in the car. She didn't cry until she was through the gate of the estate and the gate had closed behind her. Then she cried for 7 minutes. She stopped. She blew her nose. She went inside. She started downloading statements. That night, after Grant went to bed, Clara reorganized the pantry. It was 11:15. She was 32 weeks pregnant. She stood in the kitchen in her socks and a cardigan and pulled every item off every shelf. She worked methodically. Grains here, cans there, baking supplies on the left. The way her mother's kitchen had always been organized. The way Clara's first apartment had been organized before the cleaning service came and put everything somewhere logical and wrong. She worked for an hour and a half. When she finished, the pantry was organized the way she would organize it if this were her house. She stood in front of the open pantry at 12:45 in the morning. She realized she had spent 2 years living in a house organized by someone else's system, cleaned by someone else, maintained by someone else. A house where every version of home was someone else's version. She closed the pantry door. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. She went to bed. She slept better than she had in weeks. 3 days later, Clara found the accounts, not all of them, 2, in Grant's name only, $460,000. Transferred from joint assets over 14 months. She printed the statements. She put them in a folder She put the folder in the nursery, under the rocking chair, behind the foot where no one would look unless they were looking. She went back to the kitchen. She made dinner. Grant came home at 7. She was plating the pasta she'd made from scratch because her hands needed something to do. "How was your day?" she asked. "Fine," he said. "Mine too," she said. They ate dinner. She watched him across the table. She thought, "I know what you've done, and I know what I'm going to do about it." She had never been more certain of anything in her life. Grant's next business trip was supposed to last 3 days. He left on a Thursday. Clara watched him pack. He packed differently now. Fewer work clothes, more of the dark cashmere he only wore on evenings out. She counted the days since she'd found the accounts. He kissed her forehead before he left, his hand on her stomach. "Call me if anything happens." "Of course," she said. She watched his car go down the drive. Then she called Thomas Brennan. By Friday afternoon, Thomas had found something else. A consultation 3 months ago. Grant had visited a family law attorney in a city 2 hours away, not locally where he might be recognized. A single 1-hour appointment. Thomas called Clara in the nursery. She was in the rocking chair. The folder was in her lap. Thomas told her. She was quiet for a long time. "So he was going to wait until after the baby," she said. "That's my read," Thomas said. "Why after?" "He would argue for a more favorable custody arrangement with a newborn than during a pregnancy." She let that sit. The words arranged themselves in her mind like tiles. Patient, calculated, the exit planned before the entrance of his own child. "Okay," she said. "What do I do next?" Thomas told her. She wrote it down, every step, in the spiral notebook. No word wasted. When she hung up, she sat in the rocking chair in the sage green room and looked at the painted stars on the ceiling. She did not feel the way she expected to feel. She had imagined the floor dropping out. Instead, she felt something cold and very precise, like a thermometer in January, a clear, exact reading. He was already leaving, she thought. He has been leaving for a long time. He just didn't tell me. She looked at the stars. "I deserve better than this," she said out loud. Not a wish, not a hope, a declaration. "I have always deserved better than this." She pressed both hands on her stomach. "We both do," she said. Grant came home Friday afternoon. Early, the trip cut short, he said. Clara was in the living room with a book when she heard the key. She didn't hide the notebook. She didn't move the folder. She sat in the wing chair by the window and stayed exactly there. He set down his bag. He looked tired, a little rumpled. The dark cashmere had a wrinkle in it that spoke of careless removal. "Trip got cut short," he said. "Oh," she said. Even. He looked at her. Something flickered in his face. He was looking for the signal she usually gave, the small tell that meant she was upset, so he knew whether to prepare or redirect. She gave him nothing. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. It was the last time she would say it. She didn't know that yet. They made it through Friday evening, dinner, television that neither of them watched. The particular hollow silence of a shared house where the two people inside it have stopped sharing anything that matters. Saturday morning, Clara made coffee. She set it on the island. She waited. When Grant came down, she was already sitting across from his cup. The folder was in front of her. This was not a fight. That was the first thing to understand. Grant's face, when he saw the folder, moved through several expressions in quick succession. Surprise, wariness, the beginning of the redirect smile. Clara did not give him time for the smile. "Tell me about C. Ramsey," she said. He sat. He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. "She's my assistant," he said. "Tell me about the hotel." A pause, the smile started. She watched it arrive. "Clara," he said, warm, careful. Whatever you've been thinking? Tell me about the $460,000, she said. The smile stopped. In the silence that followed, she heard the refrigerator hum. She heard a car pass outside. She heard the clock in the hallway. Grant looked at the folder. He looked at her. For the first time in a very long time, she had his complete attention. How did you? It doesn't matter how, she said. I know about the hotel. I know about the money. I know about the attorney you consulted in March. He opened his mouth. Don't, she said. Don't tell me it meant nothing. Don't tell me I'm overreacting. Don't ask me to be rational. Her voice was quiet, completely controlled. Grant was looking at her the way you look at someone you realize you have misjudged in a fundamental way. I've found out, she said, that you have been planning to leave me for approximately 8 months. I found this out while I am pregnant with your child. She picked up the folder. She set it down. I need you to answer one question honestly, she said. Have you been with her this entire pregnancy? Grant was quiet, a long quiet. Then he said, yes. One word. The word sat between them on the kitchen island like something physical. Clara nodded. She stood up. She took the folder. She went upstairs. She ran a bath. She sat on the edge of the tub, fully clothed, while the water filled, feet flat on the tile, hands in her lap. She didn't cry. She was somewhere past crying. She watched the water rise. She thought about the first time she had seen this bathroom, the deep tub with the carved feet, the skylights. She had stood here during that first house viewing and thought, I could love living here. She had been thinking about the bathroom, about the house. She had been so in love with the idea of this life that she hadn't looked carefully enough at who she was going to share it with. She turned off the water. She sat in the quiet. After a while, she took off her shoes. She lowered herself into the bath, still in her clothes. She lay back. She looked at the skylight. Okay, she said. Then again, softer. Okay. Grant was gone when she came back downstairs. His bag still by the door, but the house was empty. She called Thomas. She told him what had happened. Thomas was quiet for a moment. That was very brave, he said. It wasn't brave, she said. I needed the confirmation before I made any decisions. And now you have it, he said. Now I have it, she said. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen island. She looked out at the November garden. The lights off, the party long past, the beds put to sleep for winter. She opened the notebook to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, what I need. She wrote for 20 minutes, everything. From the accounts, from the house, the tests, from custody arrangements, from herself. She wrote the way she used to design buildings, measuring load-bearing walls, accounting for every stress point. When she finished, she read it back. She closed the notebook. She said, to the empty kitchen, I am not starting over. I am starting correctly for the first time. The days that followed had a particular texture. Cold, clear, like air after a long rain. Clara did not move out of the house immediately. Thomas advised her to stay until the baby came. Leaving before the birth could complicate the legal picture. She agreed. She was practical about it now. The estate had enough rooms. Grant moved to one of the guest suites without being asked. They passed each other in the hallways, like strangers sharing a hotel. Polite, distant, each aware of the other, without any real acknowledgement. This was not a truce. It was a controlled distance. Two people managing a situation with as little additional damage as possible. Beverly Hartwell arrived on a Tuesday. 2 suitcases, a carry-on, the particular determination of a mother who has been worried for years and is finished pretending otherwise. I'm staying until the baby comes, she said at the door. Clara looked at her mother. Beverly was 60 years old, silver streaks in her brown hair, the posture of someone who had survived enough to stop apologizing for taking up space. "You didn't have to," Clara started. "I know," Beverly said. "I wanted to." She came inside. That night, they sat in the kitchen at 10:30 with decaf and no agenda. Beverly talked about her watercolor class. She admitted cheerfully, absolutely terrible at it and enjoying every minute. Clara laughed. A real laugh. The surprised kind. The kind that comes when something genuinely catches you. Beverly looked at her daughter. She didn't say anything. She just nodded once. The way mothers nod when they see something that has been needed and finally arrived. 2 a.m. Clara couldn't sleep. She went downstairs. She went through the kitchen. She went into the garage. She sat in her car. Engine off. Door closed. The particular contained stillness of a parked car in the dark. She wasn't going anywhere. She just needed this specific quiet. The smell of upholstery. The shape of the space around her. Small and defined in a way the 40-foot rooms of the house were not. She thought about all the drives she had made alone. Every prenatal appointment, every trip to Thomas's office, every grocery run with a stomach that made getting out of the car a minor project. She had made all of them alone. She thought, "I have been alone in this marriage for a long time." She sat in the car for 45 minutes. She didn't start the engine. Then she went back inside. She went to the nursery. She checked the room in the dark. The stars, the rocking chair, the dresser with the small folded clothes she had washed herself and smelled before folding them. She sat in the chair. "Almost," she said to the empty room. "Almost." November moved toward December. Grant and Clara maintained the managed distance. He was gone most days, some nights. She did not track his whereabouts anymore. The tracking had served its purpose. She had the information she needed. Everything after this was Thomas's territory. She focused on what she could control. She finished the nursery. She attended her appointments. She ate well and slept when she could, and walked through the estate garden in the mornings when the cold was clean and the light was low and flat across the frozen grass. Beverly cooked. She moved through the professional kitchen with the cheerful competence of someone accustomed to kitchens that actually functioned as kitchens. She made soup. She made bread. She made Claire's favorite. The chicken and rice dish from the recipe box that had been her mother's and her mother's mother's. In the evenings, they sat together. They watched things on television that made them laugh. They talked about Clara's childhood and Beverly's new life in Asheville and the specific tyranny of Beverly's book club, which had somehow agreed to read a 600-page historical novel in 2 weeks. Clara felt, in these evenings, something she had not felt in 2 years. Normal. The ordinary, unremarkable warmth of being in a room with someone who loved her without condition or agenda. She hadn't realized how much she had missed it until she had it back. Thomas called mid-November with an update. His investigators had confirmed the timeline. The affair had begun 14 months ago, 2 months after Clara announced her first pregnancy. 2 weeks after that pregnancy ended at 11 weeks. Clara listened. She noted the specific cruelty of the timing without dwelling on it. "The financial picture is becoming clear," Thomas said. "There's more than the 2 accounts we found. I want to keep investigating before we proceed." "How long?" she asked. "Another 2 to 3 weeks," he said. "All right," she said. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen island with her notebook. She wrote, at the top of a fresh page, "What I know." She filled the page. Then she turned to the next one. She wrote, "What I will do." She filled that page too. When Beverly came in and found her writing, she didn't ask what it was. She put a cup of tea beside the notebook and went back to what she was doing. That was, Clara thought, exactly the right response. Grant came to her in the hallway one evening. He stood outside the nursery door. She was inside, adjusting the mobile above the crib. He watched her from the doorway. "Clara," he said. She didn't stop what she was doing. She finished with the mobile. She turned around. He looked tired. He looked for the first time since all of this began, like a man who understood what he had done and could not locate a way to make it smaller. "I know there's nothing I can say," he said. "That's correct," she said. "I want to be present for the birth," he said. "If you'll allow it." She looked at him for a moment. "You're the father," she said. "I won't prevent that." He nodded. He started to say something else. "Grant," she said. "Don't, please." He nodded again. He left. She turned back to the crib. She smoothed the blanket that was already smooth. She straightened the mobile that was already straight. She said quietly to the room, "Somewhere along the way, I became invisible." She paused. "I did some of that to myself." She looked at the mobile, the small painted moons and stars turning slowly in the air from the nursery window. "I am not invisible anymore," she said. December 12th, 36 weeks. Beverly had gone home 4 days earlier. A previously planned commitment, her other grandchildren, her daughter, from Clara's father's second marriage. She would be back the following weekend. Grant was in Charlotte. Business, Clara had stopped checking whether the business was real. The housekeeper had the week off. Clara was alone in the house. It had been snowing since 4 in the afternoon, the first real snow of the season. Heavy and fast, the kind that closes roads and muffles sound and turns the world outside into something white and utterly still. Clara was in the nursery at 11 at night. She was sitting in the rocking chair. She had a book in her lap she wasn't reading. She was listening to the snow. Then she felt it. The first contraction. She had felt Braxton Hicks contractions for weeks. She knew the difference. She looked at the clock. She breathed through it. She waited. 8 minutes later, the second one. She called Dr. Howell's emergency line. "Describe what you're feeling," Dr. Howell said. The steady, unhurried voice that had talked to dozens of women through dozens of nights. Clara described it. "How far apart?" Dr. Howell asked. 8 minutes, Clara said. That was the second one. "I want you to come in right now," Dr. Howell said. "Who's with you?" Clara looked around the nursery. The empty house, the snow coming down outside the window, the painted stars on the ceiling. "I'm alone," she said, a brief pause. "Is there someone you can call?" "Yes," Clara said. She hung up. She called Grant. No answer. Voicemail. She called again. No answer. She set the phone on the arm of the rocking chair. She breathed through another contraction. Then she called Margaret Dunmore. Margaret picked up on the second ring. She had been awake, she said, because she was 70% through a murder mystery, and the villain had just been revealed. "Margaret," Clara said. "I'm in labor." "I'll be there in 5 minutes," Margaret said without pause. "Don't go outside. The driveway is icy." She arrived in 7 minutes in her 10-year-old Subaru, wearing a wool coat over her pajamas, sensible boots she had clearly put on in a hurry. She took Clara's hospital bag. She locked the house. She helped Clara down the front steps with the practical efficiency of a woman who had done difficult things before and did not make them larger than they were. The night was white and silent, snow still falling. The Subaru's headlights cut through it in solid beams. "Is there anyone else we should call?" Margaret asked, as they pulled out of the drive. "My mother," Clara said. "But she's 4 hours away." "I'll call her," Margaret said. "What's her number?" Clara told her. Margaret called Beverly on the hands-free while navigating the snowy road with complete composure. Beverly picked up on the second ring. "This is your daughter's neighbor," Margaret said, without preamble. "She's in labor. She's fine. I'm driving her to the hospital." Clara could hear her mother's voice shift register. "Tell her I'm fine," Clara said. "She says she's fine," Margaret said to Beverly. "I believe her, You should too. The Subaru made the hill without drama. All-wheel drive. Margaret had owned this car for 10 years and she was not replacing it. They drove without talking much. The heater hummed. The windshield wipers kept their steady rhythm. Outside, the world was white and muffled and still. You're doing very well, Margaret said, after Clara breathed through a contraction. You've done this before, Clara said. Driven someone to a hospital. My husband, Margaret said. 3 times in his last year. You get used to not being frightened. Did it help? Clara asked. Not being frightened? Margaret considered. It helped him, she said, knowing I wasn't scared, even when I was. Clara looked at the road ahead. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Margaret said. Just breathe. St. Clair's Regional Medical Center. The emergency entrancy, the snow-covered ambulance bay, the particular fluorescent brightness of a hospital at midnight, that specific quality of light that exists nowhere else. Neither warm nor cold, purely functional. Dr. Howell met them in triage. She looked at Clara once. Okay, she said. Let's go. Margaret settled in the waiting room with her murder mystery and a cup of vending machine coffee and the specific patience of someone who had learned how to wait. Clara was in the delivery room, alone, in the sense that the person who was supposed to be there was not there. Dr. Howell stayed close. Between contractions, Claire looked at the ceiling tiles and thought about buildings, about spaces she had designed, about what she would change about this room if she were the architect. More natural light, east-facing windows, something green in the corner, a view of something other than the parking structure. She thought, I'm going to go back to work. Not a wish, a decision. The contraction hit hard. She gripped the rail. She breathed. You're doing really well, Dr. Howell said. I know, Clara said. 3:07 in the morning, Oliver Whitfield arrived in the world, 7 pounds and 1 ounce, 6 weeks early. In every medical sense that mattered, completely fine. He cried. That specific cry, the first sound a new person makes. Too large for the body it comes from. Indignant, startled, alive. The nurse placed him in Clara's arms before she had time to prepare for anything. His weight, his warmth, his red, scrunched face, his hands, impossibly small, curled into fists at his chest. Hi-woo, Clara said. Her voice was wrecked and very quiet. Hi, there you are. Oliver stopped crying. He opened his eyes. He looked at her with the unfocused gaze of the newly arrived, not seeing her exactly, but oriented toward her voice, toward the specific warmth and sound of her. I've got you, Clara said. I have been waiting for you. The nurse stepped to her side. Is there someone we should call? She asked quietly. Clara was quiet for a moment. His father, she said. I'll give you the number. She watched the nurse step out. She held Oliver. She did not think about what happened when Grant arrived. She did not think about the estate, or the accounts, or the proceedings Thomas was preparing. She thought about this specific weight, this face, this person who was entirely new and entirely hers. She had been alone in her marriage for a long time. She was not alone right now, not even a little. The nurse returned 5 minutes later. He answered, she said. He's on his way. Clara nodded. She did not ask where he'd been. Grant arrived at 4:45, an hour and 38 minutes after Oliver was born. He came in still wearing his coat, his face when he saw Clara in the bed, his face when he saw his son. Something happened in him, something Clara watched from a distance, without judgment and without warmth, the way you watch weather move across a landscape from inside a window. This is Oliver, she said. Grant sat down beside the bed. He held out one finger. Oliver's hand closed around it. Grant made a sound she had never heard from him before, something that caught in his throat and could not resolve itself into any word. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said, not anger, exhaustion. The particular finality of a door that has been decided upon. "I know you're sorry," she said. "I know what I'm doing, and I need you to not make this harder than it already is." Grant didn't say anything. He kept his finger in Oliver's hand. Claire looked at the ceiling. She thought, this is the last morning of the old life. She thought, the new one starts now. She closed her eyes. She slept. She stayed 3 days in the hospital. Beverly arrived the morning after the birth, still in her coat. Eyes that said she had been driving since the phone rang. She came into the room, and she saw Clara in the bed with Oliver. She put a hand over her mouth. She said nothing. She sat down beside her daughter. She took Clara's free hand. They didn't speak for a long time. The room was quiet. The morning light came through the blinds in horizontal lines. Somewhere down the hall, a cart wheeled by. A voice, soft and professional. "He's so beautiful," Beverly finally said. "I know," Clara said. Beverly looked at her daughter, the careful, thorough look of a mother doing a damage assessment and trying not to show it. "You're going to be okay," Beverly said. "I know," Clara said. She meant it. That was the thing. She meant it in a way she could feel. The house on Devereaux Street had 3 bedrooms, a small yard, hardwood floors, a kitchen with south-facing windows that filled with afternoon light. Nora found it. She also negotiated the lease, coordinated the movers, and appeared on moving day with coffee and the practical energy of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Clara moved in when Oliver was 2 weeks old. She took her clothes, Oliver's things, the rocking chair from the nursery, the cookbook her mother had given her when she married, the architectural drawings from her first solo project, drawings she hadn't looked at in 18 months. She didn't take much. She didn't need much. Standing in the kitchen of the Devereaux Street house for the first time in the afternoon light, she looked at the space around her, the ordinary proportions, the single row of windows, the counters that fit a normal-sized kitchen. She thought, this is mine. Not the 40-foot living room, not the professional kitchen with the marble counters. This. The first week was the hardest thing she had ever done. Oliver fed every 2 hours at night. Beverly took shifts. 2 hours on, 2 hours off. They developed a system without discussing it, the way competent people develop systems in crisis. Through observation and adjustment, without requiring words. They drank coffee at 5 in the morning in the small kitchen, not talking, just existing in the same space. The particular companionship of 2 people who love each other and are both very tired and don't need to perform anything about it. Nora came every other day. She brought food from different restaurants, and she sat on the couch while Clara nursed, and she did not ask questions, and she did not push, and she was simply, unconditionally there. Margaret came on Saturdays with bread she baked herself and very good tea and a cheerful refusal to treat Clara like she was fragile. "You made it through the worst night," Margaret said on the first Saturday. "Everything else is just logistics." Clara had laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. "You have an interesting bedside manner," she told Margaret. "I've had time to develop it," Margaret said. "My husband was ill for 3 years. Bedside manner was the only thing I had to offer." Clara looked at her. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," Margaret said. "Grief was the best teacher I ever had. I wouldn't undo it." She said it without drama, as a plain fact. Clara thought about that for a long time afterward, 3 weeks after moving in. Midnight. Oliver had been fussy for 40 minutes. Clara was walking circles in the kitchen in her socks. Counter to island to table to window to counter. Again, again. She was humming. Not a particular song, just a steady, low sound that seemed to reach him. She passed the window. The street outside was quiet. One street light, a neighbor's car, the specific stillness of a December suburb at midnight. She stopped walking. She looked at the street. A month ago, I was alone in a 40-foot house, she thought. This 3-bedroom rental is the first place that has felt like mine. She looked down at Oliver. His eyes were closed. His breathing had shifted. She knew the rhythm of it now, the exact texture of sleep versus almost sleep. We're going to be okay, she told him, quietly, into the top of his head. We actually are. She didn't say it because it was what mothers said. She said it because it was true. Thomas called on a Thursday. He had spoken to Grant's attorney. Grant was not fighting the primary custody arrangement. He wanted to be a present father. He was prepared to be reasonable. He had also ended the relationship with Celeste Ramsey. Thomas relayed this last part carefully. He was watching to see whether it changed anything. Does that affect your position? He asked. No, Clara said. Nothing changes. I didn't think it would, he said, but I wanted to tell you. She thanked him. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table. She waited for something. The vindication. The particular satisfaction of being on the right side of a decision. Instead, she felt almost nothing about Grant at all. What she felt was something about herself, something building steadily in the background of every day she got through. She didn't have a name for it yet. She would figure it out. That evening, after Oliver was asleep, Clara took the architectural drawings out of the portfolio. She spread them on the kitchen table. The Portland project, the mixed-use development, her handwriting in the margins, notes about sightlines and natural light, and the relationship between public and private space. She looked at them for a long time. She looked at her own handwriting. She said out loud to the quiet kitchen, "Somewhere along the way, I became invisible." A pause. "I did some of that to myself." Another pause. "I'm not going to do it anymore." She touched the edge of one of the drawings. She thought about the woman who had made these marks. The version of herself that had known, without doubt, without asking permission, exactly what a space needed and why. She was still that woman. She had folded her away somewhere, the way you fold something carefully and put it in a drawer when you're not sure what to do with it. She was still there. She had been there the whole time. Celeste Ramsey called on a Tuesday evening. Clara was in the kitchen. Oliver was in his bouncy seat, studying his own hands with the focused intensity of a person who has just discovered that these things belong to him. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. Clara almost didn't answer. She answered. "Clara?" The voice was young, careful, clearly frightened. "Yes," Clara said. "This is Celeste Ramsey." A pause. "I know you don't want to hear from me, and I understand if you hang up." Clara said nothing. "I need to tell you something," Celeste said, "about the accounts. There's more than what your attorney found." The kitchen was very quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because he told me you were emotionally checked out, that your marriage had been over for years, that you were only staying for financial security." She paused. "He was a very good liar. I didn't understand how good until he lied to me too." Clara sat down at the table. She thought about what Nora had told her, about the woman in the corner booth at Crestview. She's not a caricature. Nora had been right. This was a young woman who had believed a story told to her by a very persuasive man, the same kind of story he had been telling Clara for years. Just a different version of it. "Tell me what you found," Clara said. What Celeste described took 20 minutes. A third account, an LLC registered in Delaware 18 months ago. Grant had used it to hold assets in a name that was not his. The LLC was 3 months older than the hidden accounts Thomas had found. It predated, Celeste said, the announcement of Clara's first pregnancy. He started moving money before he knew you were pregnant, Clara said. Yes, Celeste said. I found the registration when I was helping him organize some business files. He didn't know I'd seen it. Clara looked at Oliver. He had given up studying his hands. He was looking at her was now, on that direct, unfocused gaze. Why did you wait? Clara asked. Because I was still hoping he was who I thought he was, Celeste said. And then I wasn't. A quiet moment between them. Thank you, Clara said. I'm sorry, Celeste said, for all of it. I know it doesn't undo anything, Clara said. But I appreciate you calling. She hung up. She sat at the table with Oliver looking at her. She thought, she made a choice that cost her something. She thought, that matters. She picked up the phone. She called Thomas. Thomas's response, when she told him, was a brief silence followed by a single word. Good, he said. The next 2 weeks moved with the particular energy of a legal process that has found its stride. Thomas presented the LLC discovery to Grant's attorney on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, Grant's attorney called back with a revised offer, a significantly revised offer. Thomas reviewed it with Clara over the phone. This is fair, he said. More than fair, she said. Do you want to think about it? No, she said. She signed. The settlement included a fair division of marital assets, a support structure that gave Oliver security without making Clara dependent on Grant's choices month to month, and the provision Clara had specifically requested, a lump sum transferred into a trust in Oliver's name only, regardless of what happened to Grant's finances in the next 20 years. That money is Oliver's, Thomas said. No one can touch it. Clara nodded, though he couldn't see her. And the house? Thomas asked. I don't want it, she said. He paused. Are you certain? It was never mine, she said. Not in the way that mattered. Beverly went home on a Sunday when Oliver was 6 weeks old. She stood in the doorway of the Devereaux Street house with her suitcase and looked at Clara for a long moment. I didn't say enough, Beverly said. When you were first with him, I said one thing, and then I stopped. You said exactly what I needed to hear, Clara said. At the right time. Beverly looked at her. I'm proud of you, she said. I know, Clara said. I'm proud of me too. Beverly's face opened into something that was almost a laugh and almost a cry and was entirely her. She pulled Clara in. They stood on the front step in the December cold, Beverly holding her daughter the way she had held her when she was small, Clara letting herself be held without managing it. 3 weeks, Beverly said into Clara's hair. I'll be here, Clara said. She watched the car pull away. She went inside. She closed the door. She stood in the entry hall. She thought, I know how to be alone now. She thought, and I know I don't have to be. Oliver was 6 weeks old the day Clara had her first fully good day. Not a day without difficulty, not a day without tiredness. A day where the difficulty and the tiredness existed alongside something else. A lightness. A quality she had almost forgotten the name of. She took Oliver to the park. The morning was clear and cold, and the snow from weeks ago had mostly melted to gray patches in the shadows. The light was thin and very clean. She pushed the stroller along the path. She passed a woman about her age with a toddler. The woman gave her the small nod, the one that passed between parents of young children like a secret handshake. I see you. I know. Clara nodded back. She thought, I have a whole life ahead of me, not as a consolation, as a plain, observable fact. She stopped the stroller. She looked at the park, the bare trees, the pale winter sky. She said out loud, starting over feels impossible. She started walking again. Staying was worse, she said. She kept walking. 8 weeks after Oliver was born, an email arrived. Clara was at the kitchen table when it came through. Oliver was in the bouncy seat beside her. The morning light was doing the thing it did in this kitchen, flooding in at a low angle, making the whole room warm and gold. The sender was Patricia Walsh. Patricia was 52. She had run the firm where Clara worked before she'd met Grant. She had since left to start her own studio. The email was formal at first, then less so. She was pulling together a team for a new project: mixed-use development, residential above, community space below, a neighborhood that needed both. The client wanted a specific sensibility, something that understood how people actually lived, not how they were supposed to live. She had thought of Clara. "I know it's been a while," she wrote. "I know you have a new baby and that the timing is impossible. But I also know that what you did on the Portland project was some of the best design work I've seen in 10 years. This client needs exactly that. I want to at least ask." Clara read the email 3 times. She set the phone down. She picked it up. She looked at Oliver. Oliver looked back. She stood up. She walked to the kitchen doorway. "Nora," she called. Nora appeared from the living room with a cracker in her hand. "Yeah?" Clara held out the phone. Nora read the email. She put the cracker down. "Clara," she said. "I know," Clara said. Clara, this is..." "I know," Clara said again. Nora looked at her. "Are you going to do it?" Clara looked at Oliver. At the phone, at the drawings still spread on the kitchen table from the night she had taken them out of the portfolio. "Yes," she said. That night, alone in the kitchen, Beverly had taken Oliver for a few hours. Nora had gone home. The house was quiet in the particular way that it was quiet now. Not empty quiet, just evening quiet. A space she had learned to inhabit without anxiety. Clara sat at the table with the Portland drawings. She took out a pencil. She looked at the blank sheet of paper beside the drawings. She made one mark, one line. She looked at it. She thought about what Beverly had told her years ago when Clara was deciding whether to take the Portland project, a project that had scared her because it was bigger than anything she'd done. Beverly had said, "You're not starting over. You're starting correctly." Clara had forgotten that. She remembered it now. She said, quietly, to the kitchen, "The hardest part is admitting I knew all along." A pause. "I knew the marriage wasn't right. I knew I was disappearing. I saw the signs, and I explained them away because I was afraid of what they meant." She looked at the line she had drawn. "And I know something else now," she said. She picked up the pencil. "I know I'm still here." She started sketching. She worked for 2 hours. When she stopped, the page was covered in the beginning of something. Not the project yet, just the beginning of thinking about the project. The particular language of her own architectural hand, coming back like a muscle memory she hadn't known she still had. She looked at what she'd made. She was, she realized, good at this. She had always been good at this. The coffee shop was midway between their 2 neighborhoods. Patricia arrived on time. Black coffee. The specific energy of someone who had maintained passion and practicality and balance for 30 years without losing either. She opened the portfolio. She looked at the Portland drawings without speaking. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked at Clara. "You've been out for 18 months, she said. "Yes," Clara said. "Why?" "I convinced myself it was the right call," Clara said. "It wasn't." Patricia studied her. "Are you ready to come back?" Clara thought about the midnight kitchen, the parked car in the garage, the long months of being fine when she was not fine at all. She thought about the bathtub and the pantry shelves and the 7 minutes she cried in the driveway before she went inside and started downloading statements I'm not going to pretend I'm completely ready, she said. I have a 2-month-old and a settlement still finalizing and about 3 hours of unbroken sleep a night. She paused. But I'm more myself than I've been in 2 years. I know this kind of project. I know what you need on it. Patricia closed the portfolio. She opened it again. She looked at the Portland drawings one more time. Part-time to start, she said. Remote first until you're ready for on-site. We work around the baby. When do you need an answer? Clara asked. Now, Patricia said. The project starts in 3 weeks. Clara looked at her coffee cup. She looked at the portfolio. She looked out the window at the January street. Clear, cold, brand new. Yes, she said. Walking back to her car, Clara stopped on the sidewalk. Nothing happened. There was no dramatic reason to stop. No phone call. No particular moment. She just stopped. She stood on the cold sidewalk with her portfolio under her arm, and she looked up. The January sky was white and high, the particular quality of winter light that is not warm but is very clear. The kind of light that makes everything precise. The kind of light that lets you see things as they are. She thought, I gave up a career because someone told me I should rest. She thought, I gave up seeing my friends, one invitation at a time, because it felt easier. She thought, I gave up the version of myself that knew who she was. She thought, and I got her back. Not a parade, not a celebration, a plain, sober acknowledgement of something true. She stood on the cold sidewalk and let herself know it. Then she walked to her car. She buckled her seatbelt. She called Beverly. Mom, she said. I'm going back to work. Beverly made a sound Claire had never heard from her before, somewhere between relief and joy, and the particular release of a worry that has been held a very long time. I knew you would, Beverly said. I know you did, Clara said. The project began on a Monday. Clara worked from this kitchen table after Oliver's first morning nap. She worked during the long afternoon stretches when Beverly or Nora took him for walks. She worked at 11 at night when he settled in the focused silence of someone who has been away from something and missed it more than she knew. She was not out of practice. She was better than before. She didn't know exactly why, except that the last 8 months had refined something. The way difficulty, survived clearly, refines something. She could see spaces differently now. She could design for how people actually lived. Not the aspirational version, not the magazine version, the real version, the midnight kitchen version, the parked car version, the version where a woman walks circles in her socks because her baby needs the motion and she is the only person there. She designed with that. Patricia called after the first week of preliminary sketches. These are exactly right, she said. Clara didn't say, thank you. She said, I know, they are. Patricia laughed. You sound different, she said. I am different, Clara said. Oliver at 3 months old was a person. A small, very specific person with strong opinions about when he would and would not nap, which angle of light he preferred, and the precise position of his bouncy seat relative to the kitchen window. He smiled at Margaret every Saturday without fail, consistently, reliably, from the moment she walked in. He would hear her voice in the entry hall, and he would orient toward it. And by the time she appeared in the kitchen doorway, he was already smiling. Margaret accepted this honor with the grace of someone who had expected to spend her retirement alone and found herself instead in possession of a person who looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in the room. He has exceptional taste, Margaret told Clara. He absolutely does, Clara said. She watched Margaret hold Oliver with the careful, particular attention of someone who understood what a person was worth. The same attention Margaret had given Clara from the very beginning. The soup on Thursdays, before anyone knew anything. The knock on the door that never required explanation. Clara thought, sometimes the right person is just there. She thought, I wasn't as alone as I thought I was. She thought, I never have to be again. Diane Whitfield called on a Wednesday evening in January. Clara answered with measured caution. Diane's voice was what it always was, controlled, each word chosen in advance. I would like to see Oliver, she said. That can be arranged, Clara said. He deserves to know his grandmother. A pause on the line. Clara, Diane said. Yes? A longer pause. The specific pause of someone preparing to say something that does not come easily. I want you to know, Diane said, that I was not unaware of the situation, and I handled it incorrectly. Clara was quiet. This was as close to an apology as Diane Whitfield would ever come. Clara recognized it. She was under no obligation to absolve it, but she was also not interested in war with a 64-year-old woman who was going to be Oliver's grandmother, regardless of what either of them chose. Thank you for saying that, Clara said. Even. No warmth, no ice. I'll bring Oliver to see you in the new year, when things have settled. I would appreciate that, Diane said. They hung up. Clara looked at the phone. She could be angry at Diane. She had reasons. But anger required energy she had decided to spend elsewhere. She put the phone down. She went to check on Oliver. He was asleep, his fists uncurled in sleep, his face perfect and ordinary and entirely his own. She stood in the doorway of his room for a moment. She thought, he is going to have a good life. She thought, I am going to make sure of it. Not from a place of fear or determination or the particular rigidity of someone who has survived something, from a place of quiet certainty. Nora came over on a Tuesday evening in February. Oliver was asleep. Clara had opened a bottle of wine. Her first glass since before the pregnancy. Small, slow, the particular pleasure of a thing you have been without for a long time. They talked about this project, about Grant, about the year that had just passed. Do you regret it? Nora asked. Not unkindly, just wanting the real answer. Clara considered it, not the quick answer, the true one. I regret the time, she said. The years I spent keeping everything running without checking whether the thing was worth running. She turned the glass in her hands. But I don't regret what I got, she said. I got Oliver. I got out. And I learned something I couldn't have learned any other way. What? Nora said. Claire looked at the kitchen table, the drawings, the notebook, the pencil, that the only person who could let me out was me, she said. She looked at the glass. The door was unlocked the whole time, she said. I was just afraid of what was on the other side. Nora was quiet. That's terrifying, she said. Yes, Clara said. And also incredibly useful. They sat with that. The kitchen was warm. The wine was good. Oliver was asleep in the next room. The street outside was quiet. Nora said, I should have told you sooner. What I knew. You told me when I was ready, Clara said. That's what mattered. I was scared of losing you, Nora said. If you chose him. Clara looked at her friend. You couldn't have lost me, she said. I was the one who would have been losing myself. Grant came to collect Oliver for his first overnight visit in February. He arrived on time, car seat installed correctly, Clara checked, everything he needed, packed and ready. He stood on the front step of the Devereaux Street house. He looked at the house, the ordinary small house with the south-facing windows and the yard that was beginning to show the first suggestions of green. He looked at Clara, the way she stood, the way she moved, something different in her posture, something settled that hadn't been there before. You look good, he said, and then stopped himself. He tried again. You seem— I know what you mean, she said. He was quiet. Are you happy? He asked, genuinely, not as a challenge. She thought about it. I'm getting there, she said. She meant it. She bent to unbuckle Oliver from his bouncy seat. She handed him to Grant. Oliver looked at his father with the direct, uncomprehending gaze of a 3-month-old. Then he reached out and closed his hand around Grant's finger. Grant looked at his son. I'm going to be better for him, he said, quietly, to himself as much as to Clara. I know you will, she said. She meant that too, not generously, practically. Oliver deserved a good father. Claire was not invested in Grant's suffering. She was invested in Oliver's flourishing. See you Sunday, she said. She closed the door. She stood in the entry hall for a moment. She thought, that wasn't hard. She thought, a year ago it would have been. She thought, I am different. She went to the kitchen. She opened her laptop. She pulled up the project files. She worked. On a Sunday morning in March, Clara was making coffee. The kitchen was quiet. Oliver was at Grant's until noon. Beverly was in Asheville. Nora was at a client walkthrough. Margaret was at her book club. Clara was alone in her house. This used to frighten her. The empty Sunday morning, the coffee for one, the particular silence of a space with only one person's sounds in it. She made the coffee. She took it to the window. The street outside was beginning to look like early spring. A green tinge in the yard. The specific, tentative green of the season's first real effort. The light had shifted since January, not warm yet, but warmer. The quality of a morning that knows something is coming, even if it has not arrived. She held the cup with both hands. She was 31 years old. She had a 2-year architectural project. She had a son who smiled at Margaret and reached for things and looked at her with a directness that still took her breath away every single time. She had a house that was hers. She had Nora and Beverly and Margaret and Dr. Howell and Thomas Brennan and Celeste Ramsey, who had made a choice that cost her something and given Clara something important. She had the drawings on the kitchen table. She had herself. She had had herself the whole time. Even when she couldn't find her, even when she folded her away in the bottom of a drawer and told herself she was fine, she was there. She is here. Claire looked at the greening street. She thought about the 40-foot living room and the 100 white lights in the October garden and the particular feeling of standing at the edge of her own party and watching her husband work the room. She thought about the hotel receipt in the filing drawer, the late-night searches, the 7 minutes crying in the parked car, the bathtub with her clothes on, the pantry shelves at midnight, the spiral notebook with its small, precise handwriting. She thought about Margaret's Subaru in the snow, Oliver's first sound, the nurse's quiet voice in the delivery room. She thought about the first morning in the Devereaux Street kitchen, alone with a newborn, and no plan, and the terrifying freedom of having nothing left to protect except the truth. She drank her coffee. She thought, I needed all of it, she thought, not the betrayal, not the cruelty, not the years of slow disappearing, but the finding out, the deciding, the choosing, one step at a time, to move toward herself. She needed to know that she could do it. Now she knows. Oliver arrived home at noon. She heard the car. She heard the particular sound he made when something changed around him. Not crying, not laughing, the specific attentive sound of a person arriving somewhere. She went to the door. Grant on the front step with the carrier. Oliver looking out with his clear, dark eyes. Clara took the carrier. He was great, Grant said. He always is, she said. She carried Oliver inside. She set him in the bouncy seat in the kitchen, positioned just so relative to the window and the morning light. He looked at the light. She sat down at the table. The drawings were in front of her. The notebook, the pencil. She picked up the pencil. She drew. Oliver sat in the light and watched his hands. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the first true morning of March continued to arrive, quietly, without announcement, the way spring always comes, not with a proclamation, not with a spectacle, just with the sudden, undeniable fact of green. She didn't need the mansion. She didn't need the 40-foot living room or the professional kitchen or the name that got them tables at restaurants. She needed this. Her pencil, her work, her child, the particular light of a March morning that was already quietly deciding to stay.
There is a particular kind of disappearing that happens slowly, not all at once, not with a dramatic moment you can point to and say, "That's when it started." It happens the way water shapes stone, quietly, gradually, until one day you look up and you don't recognize the contours of your own life. Clara Whitfield didn't lose herself in a single betrayal. She lost herself in 1,000 small surrenders. She left her career because someone told her to rest. She stopped seeing friends because it felt easier. She learned to say fine so automatically that she forgot what a different answer would sound like. And here's the truth that this story asks us to sit with. The most uncomfortable truth of all. She knew. Not everything, not the details, but the feeling. That low, constant sound at a frequency no one else could hear. She had felt it for months, and she explained it away, because she was afraid of what it meant. We do this. We are very good at this. We build libraries of explanations, organized by subject, cross-referenced by occasion, for all the things we don't want to be true. We explain the changed behavior. We explain the distance. We explain the flowers on a Tuesday that should have been a gift, but felt more like a debt being paid. Because the explanation protects us. The explanation lets us stay. And staying, even in a life that no longer fits, feels safer than the terrifying unknown of what comes next. But Clara teaches us something critical. The door was unlocked the whole time. Not Grant, not the money, not the receipt in the drawer. The moment of change was the moment she stopped telling herself she was fine and started telling herself the truth. I know what I saw. I am not making this up. I deserve better than this, not as wishes, not as questions, as declarations. And from that moment, not before, not after, everything became possible. She didn't need the 40-foot living room. She didn't need the name that got them tables at restaurants. She needed her pencil, her work, her child, the particular light of a morning that was hers. The second lesson this story carries is quieter, but just as important. You are not as alone as you think you are. Margaret was there, with soup, before anyone knew anything was wrong. Nora was there, waiting, patiently, for the moment Clara was ready. Beverly was there, driving through the night without being asked. The people who love us are often already positioned around us, watching for the moment we are ready to be found. We are not always able to see them when we are too busy performing fine. And the third lesson, perhaps the one worth carrying the longest. Starting over is not the same as starting correctly. Clara didn't rebuild her life from scratch. She returned to what she had folded up and put away. The career, the confidence, the woman who knew without asking exactly what a space needed and why. She was there the whole time, waiting in the drawer. Whatever version of yourself you have set aside, for a relationship, for a role, for a version of life that was always someone else's version, she is still there. She has been there the whole time. This content was manually researched, developed, and edited by our team, crafted with intention to bring you stories and lessons that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. That tells us everything we need to know about you.